The shining lights of New York and the reality in the shadows. New York skyscrapers shine brightly at night, and Times Square glows with dazzling lights. But behind this brilliance lies a hidden reality, one that most people don't see or choose to ignore. That night, without telling anyone, New York City Mayor Eric Adams decided to walk the streets of his city. Not as a politician, not as a mayor, but as an ordinary man, trying to understand the struggles that remain unseen. Instead of stepping into a black SUV with tinted windows, he took the subway. He pulled his hat down, put on a simple coat, and disappeared into the crowd. No one recognized him. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was truly seeing New York. The subway was cold, filled with exhausted faces, workers coming off late shifts, students buried in their books, and some who had nowhere to go at all. At the far end of the platform, a young man crouched on a piece of old cardboard, shivering. A small cup sat in front of him, nearly empty. Adams hesitated, then approached. "Hey, buddy, do you live here?" The young man lifted his head, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't live. I just survive." The words hung in the air. Adams felt a weight in his chest. He had read reports, seen statistics. But numbers couldn't capture the emptiness in this young man's eyes. "What's your name?" Adams asked. "Does it matter?" the young man muttered. "Nobody remembers it anyway." Adams sat beside him. "Tell me your story." The young man let out a tired sigh. "I had a job once. A tiny apartment. Then rent went up. My hours got cut. 1 month turned into 3. And then," he gestured at the dirty subway floor, "this became home." Adams wanted to say something, anything, but what words could undo years of neglect? Instead, he reached into his pocket and left a few bills in the cup. The young man didn't even look at them. He simply nodded. Adams stood up and walked away, his mind heavy. There was more he needed to see. A teacher without a classroom. A few blocks away, in a quiet park, Adams noticed an elderly man sitting alone on a bench. His coat was frayed, his hands trembled as he wrote in a tattered notebook. "What are you writing?" Adams asked. The old man looked up, his eyes tired yet filled with wisdom. "Notes for the next generation," he said with a faint chuckle. "Not that anyone will read them." "You're a writer." "A teacher." His smile faded. "For 30 years, I stood in front of classrooms, shaping young minds. I believed education was the key to everything. Then one day I got sick. Hospital bills wiped out my savings. Rent went up. Before I knew it, my classroom was gone, my apartment was gone, but I kept writing." Adams swallowed hard. A teacher. A man who once shaped the future, now invisible in the city he once served. He glanced at the notebook. One line stood out. "The soul of a city is measured by how it treats its most vulnerable." A chill ran through him. He had spent years in politics, drafting policies, delivering speeches. But at that moment, he wondered, had he ever truly understood? The night shift workers. As Adams kept walking, he spotted 3 men standing under a streetlight, wearing reflective vests, shovels in their hands, repairing a section of the road. "How's the night shift treating you?" Adams asked. One of the workers chuckled. "If you work nights, you need a place to sleep during the day." Another added, "But rent is so high now, most of us are pulling double shifts. By the time we get home, it's already time to come back." Adams nodded. People working 2, sometimes 3 jobs, just to keep a roof over their heads. A city that never sleeps, because it can't afford to. Lost children in the city. A little further down the road, Adams noticed 2 kids, no older than 12 or 13, hanging around a bus stop, talking quietly to each other. "It's late. Shouldn't you 2 be home?" he asked. One of them shrugged. "We don't have a home." Adams felt a lump in his throat. Just kids. But they had already been forced to grow up. A mother's silent struggle. On a dimly lit street corner, a woman sat with her 2 young children huddled against a brick wall. They were wrapped in a worn-out blanket, their tiny hands clutching their mother's coat as they slept. But the mother wasn't sleeping. She stared into the distance, watching the city lights. Silent, tired, but unbroken. Adams approached. "Ma'am, do you need help?" She looked up, startled. Then she let out a tired laugh. "Help? You're the first person to even ask. What's your story?" She sighed. "Same as everyone else. Rent went up. Job disappeared. Family's too far to help. So here we are." Adams knelt beside her, lowering his voice. "How do you do it?" "Every night." She glanced at her children, brushing their hair from their faces. "Because I have to. Because they need me." Adams felt something tighten in his throat. He thought of his own childhood, of his mother's sacrifices, the nights she skipped meals so he and his siblings could eat, the days she worked double shifts to keep a roof over their heads. Then, from the shadows, a voice called out. A young man stepped forward and asked, "Can you change this? Or are you just going to watch?" Adams froze. He had never been confronted so directly before. He looked up at the towering skyline, then back at the people, their faces, their stories, their silent pleas. "No," he said. "This has to change. And tonight I made my decision." The morning after. The next morning, Adams stood at City Hall, looking out over the city. But he no longer saw the glass towers, the stock markets, or the high-rise apartments. He saw the subway floor, the park bench, the alleyway. And that morning, he turned to his team and spoke with a conviction he had never felt before. "The hours I spent outside last night taught me more than anything else. The true owners of New York aren't the ones in skyscrapers. They're the ones struggling to survive on our streets. We're going to make this city livable for them." Within weeks, new funding was established for the homeless. Shelter programs expanded. The decision made in a single night changed thousands of lives. Because the soul of a city is measured by how it treats its most vulnerable.